Keep the cameras out of the well, guys. Let's go.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the...
It's the Majority Report's continuing coverage of the impeachment hearings. House Intelligence Committee has reconvened, about to hear testimony from Kurt Volker, the U.S. former special representative to Ukraine, and Tim Morrison, the NSC's former official in charge of overseeing Russian European policy. Here's Schiff. Okay, get that stupid
There is a quorum present.
Here's Adam Schiff.
We'll proceed today in the same fashion as
we're going to go for, we'll stick with this for about an hour and change. I got to go record other stuff, and I'm completely exhausted. Remember, tomorrow we will be doing Gordon Sondland's stuff at the very least, and then at the very least we'll be doing the debate. We may do more. All right, but here it is.
This afternoon we will hear from two witnesses requested by the minority, Ambassador Kurt Volker.
These are Republican
State
witnesses.
Department Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and Tim Morrison, the former senior director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. I appreciate the minority's request for these two important witnesses, as well as Undersecretary of State David Hale, from whom we will hear tomorrow. As we have heard from other witnesses, when Joe Biden was considering whether to enter the race for the presidency in 2020, the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, began a campaign to weaken Vice President Biden's candidacy by pushing Ukraine to investigate him and his son. To clear away any obstacle to the scheme, days after the new Ukrainian president was elected, Trump ordered the recall of Marie Yovanovitch, the American ambassador in Kyiv, who was known for pushing anti-corruption efforts. Trump also canceled Vice President Mike Pence's participation in the inauguration of President Zelensky on May 20th, and instead sent a delegation headed by Energy Secretary Rick Perry, Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland, and Ambassador Kurt Volker. These three returned from Kyiv and briefed President Trump on their encouraging first interactions with the new Ukrainian administration. Hopes that Trump would agree to an early meeting with the Ukrainian president were soon diminished, however, when Trump pushed back. According to Volker, he just didn't believe it. He was skeptical, and he also said, "That's not what I hear. I hear, he's got some terrible people around him." President Trump also told them he believed that Ukraine tried to take him down. He told the three amigos, "Talk to Rudy." And they did. One of those interactions took place a week before the July 25th phone call between Trump and Zelensky, when Ambassador Volker had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani at the Trump Hotel. Volker testified that he pushed back on Giuliani's accusation against Joe Biden. On July 22nd, just days before Trump would talk to Zelensky, Ambassador Volker had a telephone conference with Giuliani and Andrei Yermak, a top advisor to the Ukrainian president, so that Giuliani could be introduced to Yermak. On July 25th, the same day as the call between President Trump and Zelensky, but before it took place, Ambassador Volker sent a text message to Yermak. Quote, "Heard from the White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate/get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck!" Exclamation point. Later that day, Donald Trump would have the now infamous phone call with Zelensky, in which he responded to Ukraine's appreciation for U.S. defense support and a request by President Zelensky to buy more Javelin anti-tank missiles by saying, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." And the favor involved the two investigations that Giuliani had been pushing for into the Bidens in 2016. Ambassador Volker was not on the call, but when asked about what it reflected, he testified, "No president of the United States should ask a foreign leader to help interfere in a U.S. election." Among those listening in on the July 25th call was Tim Morrison, who had taken over as the NSC's senior director for European Affairs at the NSC only days before, but had been briefed by his predecessor, Fiona Hill, about the irregular second channel that was operating in parallel to the official one. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams, from whom we heard this morning, like them, Morrison emerged from the call troubled. He was concerned enough about what he heard on the July 25th call that he went to see the NSC legal advisor soon after it had ended. Colonel Vindman's fear was that the president had broken the law, potentially, but Morrison said of his concern that his concern was that the call could be damaging if it were leaked. Soon after this discussion with lawyers at the NSC, the call record was hidden away on a secure server used to store highly classified intelligence, where it remained until late September when the call record was publicly released. Following the July 25th call, Ambassador Volker worked with Sondland and the Ukrainian president's close advisor Yermak on a statement that would satisfy Giuliani. When Yermak sent over a draft that still failed to include the specific words Burisma and 2016, Giuliani said the statement would lack credibility. Ambassador Volker then added both Burisma and 2016 to the draft statement. Both Volker and Morrison were, by late July, aware that the security assistance had been cut off at the direction of the president and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. As the Ukrainians became aware of the suspension of security assistance and the negotiations over the scheduling of a White House meeting between Trump and Zelensky dragged on, the pressure increased and any pretense that there was no linkage soon dropped away. Morrison accompanied Vice President Pence to Warsaw on September 1st, where Pence and Zelensky met, and Zelensky raised the suspended security assistance. Following that meeting, Sondland approached Yermak to tell him that he believed that what could help move the aid was if the Ukrainian prosecutor general would go to the mic and announce that he was opening the Burisma investigation. On September 7th, Ambassador Sondland had a telephone call with Trump and asked him what he wanted from Ukraine. According to Morrison, who spoke with Sondland after the call, Trump insisted that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky must personally announce the opening of the investigations, and he should want to do it. Sondland also said that if President Zelensky didn't agree to make a public statement about the investigations, the U.S. and Ukraine would be at a stalemate, meaning it would not receive the much-needed security assistance. Morrison had a sinking feeling after the call, as he realized that the ask was now being directed at Zelensky himself, and not the prosecutor general, as Sondland had relayed to a senior Ukrainian aide in Warsaw on September 1st. While President Trump claimed there was no quid pro quo, his insistence that Zelensky himself must publicly announce the investigations or they'd be at a stalemate made clear that at least two official acts, a White House meeting and $400 million in military aid, were conditioned on receipt of what Trump wanted, the investigations to help his campaign. The efforts to secure the investigations would continue for several more days, but appear to have abruptly ended soon after the three committees of Congress announced an investigation into the Trump-Giuliani-Ukraine scheme. Only then would the aid be released. I now recognize Ranking Member Nunes for any remarks he would like to make.
Welcome back to Act 2 of today's circus, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to continue what the Democrats tell us is a serious, somber, and even prayerful process of attempting to overthrow a duly elected president. If they're successful, the end result would be to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans who thought the president is chosen by the American people, not by 13 Democrat partisans on a committee that's supposed to be overseeing the government's intelligence agencies. And isn't it strange how we've morphed into the Impeachment Committee, presiding over a matter that has no intelligence component whatsoever? Impeachment, of course, is the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, not the Intelligence Committee. But putting this farce in our court provides two main advantages for the Democrats. It made it easier for them to shroud their depositions in secrecy, and it allowed them to avoid giving too big of a role in this spectacle to another Democrat committee chairman in whom the Democrat leaders obviously have no confidence.
All the depositions are out there. He's right about that with Nadler, I think, a little bit, but I mean, it's really irrelevant.
3 years saturating the airwaves with dire warnings that President Trump is a Russian agent. And these outlandish attacks continue to this very day. Just this weekend, in front of a crowd of Democratic Party activists, the chairman of this committee denounced President Trump as a profound threat to our democracy and vowed that We will send that charlatan in the White House back to the golden throne he came from. How can anyone believe that people who would utter such dramatic absurdities are conducting a fair impeachment process and are only trying to discover the truth? It's obvious the Democrats are trying to topple the president solely because they despise him.
Just a reminder, this guy jumped out of a car, almost a moving car in the middle of the night to run to the White House during the context of the Mueller investigation. To God knows do what, handle what type of information. But
no witnesses have identified any crime or impeachable offense committed by the president, but that doesn't matter. Last week, the Democrats told us his infraction was asking for a quid pro quo. This week, it's bribery. Who knows what ridiculous crime they'll be accusing him of next week. As witnesses, the Democrats have called a parade of government officials who don't like President Trump's Ukraine policy.
In exchange for another thing.
Provided Ukraine with lethal military aid after the Obama administration refused to do so. They also resent his conduct of policy through channels outside their own authority and control. These actions, they argue, contradict the so-called interagency consensus. They don't seem to understand that the president alone is constitutionally vested with the authority to set the policy. The American people elect a president, not an interagency consensus. And of course, our previous witnesses had very little new information to share in these hearings.
I have no
That's
moo
because these hearings are not
board.
designed to uncover new information. They're meant to showcase a hand-picked group of witnesses who the Democrats determined through their secret audition process will provide testimony most conductive and conducive to their accusations. In fact, by the time any witness says anything here, people are actually hearing it for the third time. They heard it first through the Democrats' cherry-picked leaks to their media sympathizers during the secret depositions. And second, when the Democrats published those deposition transcripts in a highly staged manner. Of course, there are no transcripts from crucial witnesses like Hunter Biden, who could testify about his well-paying job on the board of a corrupt Ukrainian company, or Alexander Chalupa, who worked on an election meddling scheme with Ukrainian officials on behalf of the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. That's because the Democrats refused to let us hear from them. As for evidence, what we're left with is the transcript of the Trump-Zelensky phone call, which the president made public. That means Americans can read for themselves an unremarkable conversation with President Zelensky, who repeatedly expressed satisfaction with the call afterward. The Democrats, however, claim President Zelensky was being bribed, and therefore he must be lying when he says the call was friendly and posed no problems. There's some irony here. For weeks, we've heard the Democrats bemoan the damage President Trump supposedly caused to the U.S.-Ukrainian relations. But when the Ukrainian president contradicts their accusations, they publicly dismiss him as a liar. I may be wrong, but I'm fairly sure calling a friendly foreign president, newly elected, a liar, violates their so-called interagency consensus. So overall, the Democrats would have you believe President Zelensky was being blackmailed with a pause on lethal military aid that he didn't even know about, that President Trump did not mention to him, and that diplomats have testified they always assumed would be lifted, which it was. Without the Ukrainians undertaking any of the actions they were supposedly being coerced into doing. This process is not serious, it's not sober, and it is certainly not prayerful. It's an ambitious attack to deprive the American people of the right to elect a president that the Democrats don't like. As I mentioned, the chairman of this committee claims that democracy is under threat. If that's true, it's not the president who poses the danger. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We are joined this afternoon by Ambassador Kurt Volker and Mr. Timothy Morrison. Ambassador Kurt Volker served in the U.S. Foreign Service for nearly 30 years. working on European and Eurasian political and security issues under 5 different presidential administrations. During the George W. Bush administration, he served as the acting director for European and Eurasian Affairs in the National Security Council and later as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. In 2008, President Bush appointed Ambassador Volker to the United States Permanent Representative to NATO, where he served until May 2009. In July 2017, Ambassador Volker was appointed to be the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, serving in that position until he resigned in September. It is a pleasure to welcome Mr. Morrison back to the legislative branch, where he served for almost 2 decades as a Republican staffer. He was a professional staff member for Representative Mark Kennedy of Minnesota and Senator John Kyle of Arizona. Later, Mr. Morrison served as the longtime policy director for the Republican staff of the House Armed Services Committee. In July 2018, Mr. Morrison joined the National Security Council as Senior Director for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction. Following the departure of Dr. Fiona Hill in July 2019, Mr. Morrison assumed the position of Senior Director for Russia and Europe. 2 final points before the witnesses are sworn. First, witness depositions as part of this inquiry were unclassified in nature, and all open hearings will also be held at the unclassified level. Any information that may touch on classified information will be addressed separately. Second, Congress will not tolerate any reprisal, threat of reprisal, or attempt to retaliate against any U.S. government official for testifying before Congress, including you or of any of your colleagues. If you would both please rise and raise your right hand, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Without objection, your written statements will also be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Morrison, you are recognized for your opening statement, and immediately thereafter, Ambassador Volker, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunez, and members of the committee, I appear before you today under subpoena to answer your questions about my time as Senior Director for European Affairs at the White House and the National Security Council, as related to Ukraine and U.S. security sector assistance to that country. I will provide you the most complete and accurate information I can, consistent with my obligations to protect classified and privileged information. Whether the conduct that is the subject of this inquiry merits impeachment is a question for the U.S. House of Representatives. I appear here today only to provide factual information based upon my knowledge and recollection of events. I will not waste time restating the details of my opening statement from my deposition on October 31, 2019, which has recently been made public. However, I will highlight the following key points. First, as I previously stated, I do not know who the whistleblower is, nor do I intend to speculate as to who the individual may be. Second, I have great respect for my former colleagues from the NSC and the rest of the interagency. I am not here today to question their character or integrity. My recollections and judgments are my own. Some of my colleagues' recollections of conversations and interactions may differ from mine, but I do not view those differences as the result of an untoward purpose. Third, I continue to believe Ukraine is on the front lines of a strategic competition between the West and Vladimir Putin's revanchist Russia. Russia is a failing power, but it is still a dangerous one. The United States aids Ukraine and her people so they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. Support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty has been a bipartisan objective since Russia's military invasion in 2014. It must continue to be. As I stated during my deposition, I feared at the time of the call on July 25th how its disclosure would play in Washington's political climate. My fears have been realized. I understand the gravity of these proceedings, but I beg you not to lose sight of the military conflict underway in eastern Ukraine today, the ongoing illegal occupation of Crimea, and the importance of reform of Ukraine's politics and economy. Every day that the focus of discussion involving Ukraine is centered on these proceedings instead of those matters is a day when we are not focused on the interests Ukraine, the United States, and Western-style liberalism share. Finally, I concluded my active service at the National Security Council the day after I last appeared before you. I left the NSC completely of my own volition. I felt no pressure to resign, nor have I feared any retaliation for my testimony. I made this career choice sometime before I decided to testify on October 31st. I'm prepared to answer your questions to the best of my ability and recollection.
Thank you. Ambassador Volker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide this testimony today. As you know, I was the first person to come forward to testify as part of this inquiry. I did so voluntarily, and likewise voluntarily provided relevant documentation in my possession in order to be as cooperative, clear, and complete as possible. I am here today voluntarily, and I remain committed to cooperating fully and truthfully with this committee. All I can do is provide the facts as I understood them at the time. I did this on October 3rd in private, and I will do so again today. Like many others who have testified in this inquiry, I'm a career foreign policy professional. I began my career as an intelligence analyst for Northern Europe for the Central Intelligence Agency in 1986, before joining the State Department in 1988. I served in diplomatic postings primarily focused on European political and security issues for over 20 years under Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. My last three positions before leaving the Senior Foreign Service in 2009 were as Director for NATO and West European Affairs at the National Security Council, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the State Department, and finally, as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. In the spring of 2017, then Secretary of State Tillerson asked if I would come back to government service as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. I did this on a part-time, voluntary basis with no salary paid by the U.S. taxpayer, simply because I believed it was important to serve our country in this way. I believed I could steer U.S. policy in the right direction. For over 2 years, as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, my singular focus was advancing the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. In particular, that meant pushing back on Russian aggression and supporting the development of a strong, resilient, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine, one that overcomes a legacy of corruption and becomes integrated into a wider transatlantic community. This is critically important for U.S. national security. If we can stop and reverse Russian aggression in Ukraine, we can prevent it elsewhere. If Ukraine, the cradle of Slavic civilization predating Moscow, succeeds as a freedom-loving, prosperous, and secure democracy, it gives us enormous hope that Russia may one day change, providing a better life for Russian people and overcoming its current plague of authoritarianism, corruption, aggression toward neighbors, and threats to NATO and the United States. The stakes for the United States in a successful Ukraine could not be higher. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. As you know from the extensive real-time documentation I have provided, Vice President Biden was not a topic of our discussions. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump until the transcript of that call was released on September 25th, 2019. From July 7, 2017 until September 27, 2019, I was the lead U.S. diplomat dealing with Russia's war on Ukraine. My role was not some irregular channel, but the official channel. I reported directly to Secretaries of State Tillerson and Pompeo, kept the National Security Advisor and Secretary of Defense well informed of my efforts, and worked closely with Ambassador Masha Yovanovitch, NSC Senior Director Hill and her successor Tim Morrison, then Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell and his successor, Acting Assistant Secretary Phil Reeker, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper, NSC Director Alex Vindman, and many, many others. I have known many of them for several years. It was a team effort. When Ambassador Yovanovitch left Kyiv, I identified and recommended Bill Taylor to Secretary Pompeo, so we would still have a strong, seasoned professional on the ground. For 2 years before the events at the heart of this investigation took place, I was the most senior U.S. diplomat visiting the conflict zone, meeting with victims of Russia's aggression, urging increased U.S. security assistance, including lethal defensive weapons, working with Ukrainian President Poroshenko and then his successor, President Zelensky, and their teams, working with France and Germany in the so-called Normandy process, pressing for support from NATO, the EU, and OSCE, supporting the OSCE's special monitoring mission, and engaging in negotiations and other contacts with Russian officials. At the time I took the position in the summer of 2017, there were major complicated questions swirling in public debate about the direction of U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Would the administration lift sanctions against Russia? Would it make some kind of grand bargain with Russia in which it would trade recognition of Russia's seizure of Ukrainian territory for some other deal in Syria or elsewhere? Would the administration recognize Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea? Will this just become another frozen conflict? There were also a vast number of vacancies in key diplomatic positions, so no one was really representing the United States in the negotiating process about ending the war in eastern Ukraine. During over 2 years of my tenure as U.S. Special Representative, we fundamentally turned U.S. policy around. U.S. policy toward Ukraine was strong, consistent, and enjoyed support across the administration, bipartisan support in Congress, and support among our allies and Ukraine. We changed the language commonly used to describe Russia's aggression. I was the administration's most outspoken public figure highlighting Russia's invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine, calling out Russia's responsibility to end the war. I visited the war zone 3 times, meeting with soldiers and civilians alike, always bringing media with me to try to raise the public visibility of Russia's aggression and the humanitarian impact on the lives of the citizens of the Donbass. We coordinated closely with our European allies in Canada to maintain a united front against Russian aggression and for Ukraine's democracy, reform, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Ukraine policy is perhaps the one area where the U.S. and its European allies had been in lockstep. This coordination helped to strengthen U.S. sanctions against Russia and to maintain EU sanctions as well. Along with others in the administration, I strongly advocated for lifting the ban on the sale of lethal defensive weapons, or lethal defensive arms to Ukraine, advocated for increasing U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, and urged other countries to follow suit. My team and I drafted the Pompeo Declaration of July 25, 2018, in which the Secretary clearly and definitively laid out the U.S. policy of non-recognition of Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea. I engaged with our allies, with Ukraine, and with Russia in negotiations to implement the Minsk agreements, holding a firm line on insisting on the withdrawal of Russian forces, dismantling of the so-called People's Republics, and restoring Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Together with others in the administration, we kept U.S. policy steady through presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine and worked hard to strengthen the U.S.-Ukraine bilateral relationship under the new president and government, helping shepherd in a peaceful transition of power in Ukraine. So in short, whereas 2 years ago, most observers would have said that time is on Russia's side, by 2019, when I departed, we had turned the tables, and time was now on Ukraine's side. It's a tragedy for the United States and for Ukraine that our efforts in this area, which were bearing fruit, have now been thrown into disarray. One of the critical aspects of my role as U.S. Special Representative was that as the most senior U.S. official appointed to work solely on the Ukraine portfolio, I needed to step forward to provide leadership. If we needed to adopt a policy position, I made the case for it. If anyone needed to speak out publicly, I would do it. When we failed to get a timely statement about Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine's Navy and seizure of Ukraine's sailors, I tweeted about it in order to condemn the act. If a problem arose, I knew it was my job to try to fix it. That was my perspective when I learned in May 2019 that we had a significant problem that was impeding our ability to strengthen our support for Ukraine's new president in his effort to ramp up Ukraine's fight against corruption and implementation of needed reforms. I found myself faced with a choice: to be aware of a problem and to ignore it, or to accept that it was my responsibility to try to fix it. I tried to fix it. The problem was that despite the unanimous positive assessment and recommendations of those of us who were part of the U.S. presidential delegation that attended the inauguration of President Zelensky, President Trump was receiving a different negative narrative about Ukraine and President Zelensky. That narrative was fueled by accusations from Ukraine's then Prosecutor General and conveyed to the president by former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. As I previously told this committee, I became aware of the negative impact this was having on our policy efforts when 4 of us, who were part of the presidential delegation to the inauguration, met as a group with President Trump on May 23rd. We stressed our finding that President Zelensky represented the best chance for getting Ukraine out of the mire of corruption it had been in for over 20 years. We urged him to invite President Zelensky to the White House. The president was very skeptical. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, that's understandable. He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said, "They tried to take me down." In the course of that conversation, he referenced conversations with Mayor Giuliani. It was clear to me that despite the positive news and recommendations being conveyed by this official delegation about the new president, President Trump had a deeply rooted negative view on Ukraine rooted in the past. He was receiving other information from other sources, including Mayor Giuliani, that was more negative, causing him to retain this negative view. Within a few days, on May 29th, President Trump indeed signed the congratulatory letter to President Zelensky, which included an invitation to the president to visit him at the White House. However, more than 4 weeks passed, and we could not nail down a date for the meeting. I came to believe that the president's long-held negative view toward Ukraine was causing hesitation in actually scheduling the meeting, much as we had seen in our Oval Office discussion. After weeks of reassuring the Ukrainians that it was just a scheduling issue, I decided to tell President Zelensky that we had a problem with the information reaching President Trump from Mayor Giuliani. I did so in a bilateral meeting at a conference on Ukrainian economic reform in Toronto on July 2nd, 2019, where I led the U.S. delegation. I suggested that he call President Trump directly in order to renew their personal relationship and to assure President Trump that he was committed to investigating and fighting corruption, things on which President Zelensky had based his presidential campaign. I was convinced that getting the 2 presidents to talk with each other would overcome the negative perception of Ukraine that President Trump still harbored. President Zelensky's senior aide, Andriy Yermak, approached me several days later to ask to be connected to Mayor Giuliani. I agreed to make that connection. I did so because I understood that the new Ukrainian leadership wanted to convince those, like Mayor Giuliani, who believed such a negative narrative about Ukraine, that times have changed, and that, under President Zelensky, Ukraine is worthy of U.S. support. Ukrainians believe that if they could get their own narrative across in a way that convinced Mayor Giuliani that they were serious about fighting corruption and advancing reform, Mayor Giuliani would convey that assessment to President Trump, thus correcting the previous negative narrative. That made sense to me, and I tried to be helpful. I made clear to the Ukrainians that Mayor Giuliani was a private citizen, the president's personal lawyer, and not representing the U.S. government.
Whoops.
Likewise, in my conversations with Mayor Giuliani, I never considered him to be speaking on the president's behalf or giving instructions.
You got that wrong.
Rather, the information flow was the other way, from Ukraine to Mayor Giuliani, in the hopes that this would clear up the information reaching President Trump. On July 10th, after hearing from Mr. Yermak, I wrote to Mayor Giuliani to seek to get together, and finally on July 19th, we met for breakfast for a longer discussion. At that meeting, I told Mr. Giuliani that in my view, the Prosecutor General with whom he had been speaking, Mr. Lutsenko, was not credible and was acting in a self-serving capacity. To my surprise, Mayor Giuliani said that he had already come to that same conclusion. Mr. Giuliani also mentioned both the accusations about Vice President Biden and about interference in the 2016 election, and stressed that all he wanted to see was for Ukraine to investigate what happened in the past and apply its own laws. Concerning the allegations, I stressed that no one in the new team governing Ukraine had anything to do with anything that may have happened in 2016. They were making television shows at the time. I also said that it's not credible to me that former Vice President Biden would have been influenced in any way by financial or personal motives in carrying out his duties as Vice President. A different issue is whether some individual Ukrainians may have attempted to influence the 2016 election or thought they could buy influence. That is at least plausible, given Ukraine's reputation for corruption. But the accusation that Vice President Biden acted inappropriately did not seem at all credible to me. After that meeting, I connected Mayor Giuliani and Mr. Yermak by text and later by phone. They met in person on August 2nd, 2019. In conversations with me following that meeting, which I did not attend, Mr. Giuliani said that he had stressed the importance of Ukraine conducting investigations into what happened in the past, and Mr. Yermak stressed that he told Mr. Giuliani it is the government's program to root out corruption and implement reforms, and they would be conducting investigations as part of this process anyway. Mr. Giuliani said he believed the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about fighting corruption and that he had discussed this with Mr. Yermak. I said I did not think that this would be a problem since that is the government's position anyway. I followed up with Mr. Yermak, and he said that they would indeed be prepared to make a statement. He said it would reference Burisma and 2016 in a wider context of bilateral relations and rooting out corruption anyway. There was no mention of Vice President Biden. Rather, in referencing Burisma and 2016 election interference, it was clear to me that he, Mr. Yermak, was only talking about whether any Ukrainians had acted inappropriately. At this time, I was focused on our goal of getting President Zelensky and President Trump to meet with each other, and I believed that their doing so would overcome the chronically negative view President Trump had toward Ukraine. I was seeking to solve the problem I saw,
Pointy head,
and we met with
not
President
true.
Trump in the Oval Office on May 23rd. As a professional diplomat, I was comfortable exploring whether there was a statement Ukraine could make about its own intentions to investigate possible corruption that would be helpful in convincing Mr. Giuliani to convey to President Trump a more positive assessment of the new leadership in Ukraine. On August 16th, Mr. Yermak shared a draft with me, which I thought looked perfectly reasonable. It did not mention Burisma or 2016 elections, but was generic. Ambassador Sondland and I had a further conversation with Mr. Giuliani, who said that in his view, in order to be convincing that this government represented real change in Ukraine, the statement should include specific reference to Burisma and 2016. Again, there was no mention of Vice President Biden in these conversations. Ambassador Sondland and I discussed these points, and I edited the statement drafted by Mr. Yermak to include these points to see how it looked. I then discussed it further with Mr. Yermak. He said that for a number of reasons, including the fact that Mr. Lutsenko was still officially the Prosecutor General, they did not want to mention Burisma or 2016. I agreed, and the idea of putting out a statement was shelved. These were the last conversations I had about this statement, which were on or about August 17 to 18. My last contact with Mr. Giuliani, according to my records, was on August 13th, until he tried to reach me on September 20th after the impeachment inquiry was launched. At this time, that is to say, in the middle of August, I thought the idea of issuing this statement had been definitively scrapped. In September, I was surprised to learn that there had been further discussions with the Ukrainians about President Zelensky possibly making a statement in an interview with U.S. media similar to what we had discussed in August. Since these events, and since I gave my testimony on October 3rd, a great deal of additional information and perspectives have come to light. I've learned many things that I did not know at the time of the events in question. First, at the time I was connecting Mr. Yermak and Mr. Giuliani and discussing with Mr. Yermak and Ambassador Sondland a possible statement that could be made by the Ukrainian president, I did not know of any linkage between the hold on security assistance and Ukraine pursuing investigations. No one had ever said that to me, and I never conveyed such a linkage to the Ukrainians. I opposed the hold on U.S. security assistance as soon as I learned about it on July 18th, and I thought we could turn it around before the Ukrainians ever knew or became alarmed about it. I did not know the reason for the hold, but I viewed it as a U.S. policy problem that we needed to fix internally, and I was confident we would do so. I believe the Ukrainians became aware of the hold on August 29th and not before. That date is the first time any of them asked me about the hold by forwarding an article that had been published in Politico. When I spoke to the Ukrainians about the hold after August 29th, instead of telling them that they needed to do something to get the hold released, I told them the opposite, that they should not be alarmed. It was an internal U.S. problem, and we were working to get it fixed. I did not know others were conveying a different message to them around the same time. Second, I did not know about the strong concerns expressed by then National Security Advisor John Bolton to members of his NSC staff regarding the discussion of investigations. I participated in the July 10th meeting between National Security Advisor Bolton and then Ukrainian Chairman of the National Security and Defense Council, Alex Danylyuk. As I remember, the meeting was essentially over when Ambassador Sondland made a general comment about investigations. I think all of us thought it was inappropriate. The conversation did not continue, and the meeting concluded. Later on in the wardroom, I may have been engaged in a side conversation or had already left the complex because I do not recall further discussion regarding investigations or Burisma. Third, I did not understand that others believed that any investigation of the Ukrainian company Burisma, which had a history of accusations of corruption, was tantamount to investigating Vice President Biden. I drew a sharp distinction between the two. It has long been U.S. policy under multiple administrations to urge Ukraine to investigate and fight internal corruption. I was quite comfortable with Ukraine making its own statement about its own policy of investigating and fighting corruption at home. At the one in-person meeting I had with Mayor Giuliani on July 19th, Mayor Giuliani raised and I rejected the conspiracy theory that Vice President Biden would have been influenced in his duties as vice president by money paid to his son. As I previously testified, I have known Vice President Biden for 24 years. He is an honorable man,
Never
and
Trumper.
I hold him in the highest regard. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. And as you know from the extensive documentation I provided, Vice President Biden was not a topic of discussion. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky, and I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump until the transcript of that call was released on September 25th, 2019. Throughout this time, I understood that there was an important distinction between Burisma and Biden, and I urged the Ukrainians to maintain such a distinction. I did not know that President Trump or others had raised Vice President Biden with the Ukrainians, or had conflated the investigation of possible Ukrainian corruption with investigation of the former vice president. In retrospect, for the Ukrainians, it would clearly have been confusing. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Fourth, much has been made of the term Three Amigos in reference to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, and myself. I've never used that term and frankly cringe when I hear it, because for me, the Three Amigos will always refer to Senator McCain, Senator Lieberman, and Senator Graham in reference to their work to support the surge in Iraq. Moreover, I was never aware of any designation by President Trump or anyone else putting Ambassador Sondland or the three of us as a group in charge of Ukraine policy. Rather, as I understood it, each of us, in our own respective official capacities, continued to work together after our attendance at President Zelensky's inauguration to push for greater U.S. support for Ukraine. Leading the diplomacy around Ukraine negotiations had long been my official responsibility, but I welcomed the added support and influence of a cabinet member and our EU ambassador. Fifth, I was not aware that Ambassador Sondland spoke with President Trump on July 26th, while Ambassador Taylor and I were visiting the conflict zone. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, allow me to thank you again for the opportunity to provide this
Volker
testimony.
has basically just said, I was on Team Regular, had no idea. Had I known, it would have been a big problem, and mistakenly did not realize that the real Three Amigos are Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short.
Members, there'll be 45 minutes of questions conducted by the chairman.
Now look, folks, here's the deal. I got about 20 minutes until I've got to do a record for Ring of Fire. So we'll hang in there, and then I got to go off. But that's basically what we've got. Volker is not going to be a friendly witness to the Republicans. I'm not sure why they called him. He seems to basically say, I didn't know anything, but if I knew what I now know, it would have been a problem.
Now former Attorney General Lutsenko was not credible. Mr. Lutsenko is the author of a number of allegations against Ambassador Yovanovitch, a number of allegations that were shared with John Solomon of the Hill, a number of allegations that have been repeatedly brought up by my
for the Republican
colleagues.
About to destroy John Solomon
why is it
and all of the
that
basis
you found
of the
Mr. Lutsenko not credible
Fox
and told Mr. Giuliani so?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, the allegations themselves, including those against Ambassador Yovanovitch, did not appear to me to be credible at all. I know her to be an incredibly competent professional, someone I've worked with for many, many years. The suggestions that she was acting in some inappropriate manner were not credible to me. I've known Vice President Biden for a long time. Those accusations were not credible. And then separate from that, I also was aware of the political situation in Ukraine. We had a situation where President Poroshenko appeared to not be in a favorable position going into the elections, where it was increasingly apparent then candidate Zelensky was going to win. As is often the case in Ukraine, a change in power would mean change in prosecutorial powers as well. And there have been efforts in the past at prosecuting the previous government. I think Mr. Lutsenko, in my estimation, and I said this to Mayor Giuliani when I met with him, was interested in preserving his own position. He wanted to avoid being fired by a new government in order to prevent prosecution of himself, possible prosecution of himself. Possibly also this is something that President Poroshenko would have welcomed as well, because he probably would have avoided any efforts to prosecute President Poroshenko as well. So by making allegations like this and making sure they were reaching U.S. media, I think that Mr. Lutsenko was trying to make himself appear to be an important and influential player in the United States.
Ambassador, let me also ask you about the allegations against Joe Biden, because that has been a continuing refrain from some of my colleagues as well. Why was it that you found the allegations against Joe Biden related to his son or Burisma not to be believed?
Simply because I've known former Vice President Biden for a long time. I know how he respects his duties of higher office, and it's just not credible to me that a Vice President of the United States is going to do anything other than act as how he sees best for the national interest.
And finally, Ambassador, before I turn it over, I was struck by something you said on page 8 of your statement, which reads, "In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect," you said, "I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections." What is it now, Ambassador, in retrospect, that you recognize that you didn't at this time, that leads you to conclude that you would or should have raised these objections?
Yeah. That others did not see the distinction between these things as I saw it. As I said, there is a history of corruption in Ukraine. There's a history with the company of Burisma that's been investigated. That is well known. There is a separate allegation about the Vice President acting inappropriately. His son was a board member of this company, but those things I saw as completely distinct. And what I was trying to do in working with the Ukrainians was to thread a needle, to see whether things that they can do that are appropriate and reasonable as part of Ukraine's own policy of fighting corruption, that help clarify for our president that they are committed to that very effort. If there's a way to thread that needle, I thought it was worth the effort to try to solve that problem. As it turns out, I now understand that most of the other people didn't see or didn't consider this distinction, that for them it was synonymous.
Well, one of those people who saw it synonymous turns out to be the President of the United States. I take it you didn't know until the call record was released that the President in that call doesn't raise Burisma. He asked for an investigation of the Bidens. Is that right?
That is correct.
I take it, since you say that you acknowledge that asking for an investigation of the Bidens would have been unacceptable and objectionable, that had the President asked you to get Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, you would have told him so.
I would have objected to that, yes, sir.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one follow-up on that, Ambassador Volker. When you say thread the needle, you mean that you understood the relationship between Vice President Biden's son and Burisma, but you were trying to separate the two of them in your mind? Is that right?
Well, I believe that they were separate. This references the conversation I had with Mr. Giuliani as well, where I think the allegations against Vice President Biden are self-serving and not credible. Separate question is whether it is appropriate for Ukraine to investigate possible corruption of Ukrainians that may have tried to corrupt things or buy influence. To me, they are very different things. And as I said, I think the former is unacceptable. I think the latter in this case is
understood. But you understood the relationship between Hunter Biden and Burisma.
I knew that he had been a board member of the company, yes.
Let's go back.
That's why it was so important to maintain a distinction.
Let's focus on the July 25th call for a moment. And Mr. Morrison, July 25th was day number what for you as the senior director overseeing Ukraine?
I officially took over on the 15th, approximately 10 days, very few days actually in the office.
You testified in your deposition that you received an email on the morning of July 25th from Ambassador Sondland shortly before the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And I believe in that email, Ambassador Sondland told you that he had briefed President Trump about in advance of the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also testified that Ambassador Sondland had told you on another occasion that he could call the president whenever he wanted. Is that right?
Yes.
And on July 25th, did you in fact make an effort to confirm whether or not the phone call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump actually occurred?
I did.
And did it happen?
Yes.
On other occasions, when Ambassador Sondland told you that he spoke with President Trump, on some other occasions, did you also seek confirmation of that fact?
On some, yes.
And on those occasions when you did seek to confirm that they had spoken, what did you find?
They had.
Now I'm going to pull up a text message on the morning of July 25th it should be another one. Ambassador Sondland with you, Ambassador Volker. And at 7:54, in the morning, Ambassador Sondland says, call ASAP. Then at 9:35, Ambassador Volker, you respond. Is the screen working in front of you or just to the side? Yeah. So if you could go ahead and read what you said.
Yes.
At 9:35.
Yes. So I say, hi, Gordon, got your message. Had a great lunch with Yermak and then passed your message to him. He will see you tomorrow. Think everything is in place.
And who is Yermak?
Andriy Yermak is the senior advisor to President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Now, what was the message that you had received?
That President Zelensky should be clear, convincing, forthright with President Trump about his commitment to fighting corruption, investigating what happened in the past, get to the bottom of things, whatever there is. And if he does that, President Trump was prepared to be reassured that he would say, yes, come on, let's get this date for this visit scheduled.
And did you understand from that message that Ambassador Sondland had spoken to President Trump?
I wasn't sure whether he had or not. He, as Mr. Morrison just said that he does speak with President Trump. I knew that he had conversations in general. I didn't know specifically about one leading up to this.
Now on the screen in front of you is another text message from you that same morning.
Yes.
At 8:36 in the morning to Andrei Yermak.
Yes, I believe because of the time difference, this is actually in the afternoon in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, and so this is East Coast time, that's right.
Right.
So this is slightly less than a half hour before the call between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Right.
And can you just read what you wrote there?
Yes, and just after the lunch that I had with Andrei Yermak. It says, good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow, Kurt.
And does this accurately relay the message that you had received from Ambassador Sondland?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Morrison, did the National Security Council also prepare talking points for President Trump for this call?
The NSC staff did, yes.
And per usual custom, were these talking points based on the official United States policy objectives?
They were.
And since there's been a little bit of dispute about what that means, can you explain how official U.S. policy is determined through the interagency process?
We operate under what's known as NSPM 4, National Security Presidential Memorandum 4. It's available on the internet. That lays out how the president wants to be provided options for his decision.
And there's an extensive process to finalize any policy, is that right?
Sometimes.
Did you, Mr. Morrison, you listened to this call on the 25th, is that right?
I did.
Where did you listen from?
The White House Situation Room.
In your deposition, you testified that the call was not what you were hoping to hear. What did you mean by that?
I was hoping for a more full-throated statement of support from the president concerning President Zelensky's reform agenda, given where we were at the time with respect to the overwhelming mandate President Zelensky's servant of the party people had received in the Rada election.
And that Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, that election had occurred 4 days earlier?
Sounds right.
And President Zelensky's party won in a landslide, is that right?
They received more than a majority in their own right.
So at least in Ukraine, there was tremendous support for Zelensky's anti-corruption agenda, is that right?
At the time.
And within the interagency, within the national security agencies here in the United States, was there broad support for President Zelensky?
There was broad support for giving President Zelensky a chance.
And to that point, he had shown that he had at least put his money where his mouth was for the 3 months that he had been in office. Is that right?
Approximately 3 months, yes.
Now I want to show a couple of excerpts from this call record to each of you. The first is President Trump responding to a comment by President Zelensky related to defense support from the United States and the purchase of javelins. And President Trump then says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. And if we could go to the next excerpt, where President Trump says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server, the 2016 election, and to Vice President Biden and his son, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
And were they consistent with what you understood at that time to be official U.S. policy?
I was not aware of much of this at the time.
And in fact, subsequent to this call, you did nothing to implement the investigations that President Trump implement the request for the investigations that President Trump asked for. Is that right?
I did not understand any instruction to do so.
And you were not aware of anyone else within you coordinate the interagency process, and you were not aware of anyone else who was doing that either, is that right?
Correct.
Now, you testified in your deposition that hearing this call confirmed what you called the parallel process that your predecessor, Fiona Hill, had warned you about. What did you mean by that?
During the period in which Dr. Hill and I were conducting handoff meetings so that I could be up to speed on the various things that were occurring in the portfolio at the time, she mentioned the traditional NSPM4 process and the parallel process. And in the context of discussing the parallel process, she mentioned issues like Burisma, which were noteworthy to me at the time because I had never heard of them before. And upon hearing them in the call, it wound up confirming, okay, there's something here.
And who did she inform you was involved in this parallel process?
As I recall, it was definitely Ambassador Sondland and I believe Mr. Giuliani.
And after she informed you of this company, Burisma, what, if anything, did you do to determine what that was?
After that particular handoff meeting, I proceeded to look it up on the internet. I Googled it.
And did you find that it had some association with Hunter Biden?
Yes.
Now, Ambassador Volker, you did not listen to this call, but you testified that you were surprised and troubled when you read the call record after it was released on September 25th.
We'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for Sunderland. Keep watching. I will recap some of this tomorrow. And I'm sorry, but we have the studio needs to record something else right now. Thank you for joining us. Head over. You can do it on C-SPAN. We will be back tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow.
I'd like to phrase it in my own words now.
It might take all the strength I got